Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. Chef has been our sponsor for the podcast from ChefConf here in Austin, Texas. Learn more about Habitat, Inspec, and Chef's focus on continuous automation at chef.io. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here at ChefConf, and again with my good friend Kelsey Hightower. Hey, Kelsey, how are you?
I'm the co-host now.
Yeah,
once
definitely.
Once you do more than 2 of these in the same month,
yeah, you become the co-host.
think so. That means you guys need my W-2.
Exactly,
right?
We do need your W-2. Exactly. We'll get that going. Hey, so what did you do last night? So you put this tweet out, and you said, hey, if you want me to change my presentation to focus on Habitat and Kubernetes, let me know. And so I retweeted it. I think you had dozens and dozens of other people retweet it as well. So you came up on stage today, and you did this really cool demo, right? And you learned Habitat last night. And then you showed Kubernetes, and you used Google Now with OK Google. So take us, so where did you have to start with this last night?
So I was watching the keynotes the day before like everyone else.
Yeah.
And they had this very small glimpse of like Habitat. I was like, I want to see more though. Like, what does it do? What does it not do? Where's the overlap? And they deployed it to Kubernetes. And I was like, well, I can't let people walk away with just a small preview of Kubernetes. That's like literally my job.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, I want to learn more Habitat, and they kind of put the call to action out.
Yeah.
And a lot of people ask me, what do I think about Habitat? And I try to be very responsible and respectful with my ideas and opinions. So I was like, I'm going to learn it today at ChefConf. So that night, I went to say, what does it take to learn it? And some of the developers are here, very awesome people. And I was like, I'm going to build an app from scratch and go through the whole process and deploy it on Kubernetes. And that's kind of where I started. But once I got going, that's when I started to build some custom integrations and did some custom stuff for the conference.
Interesting. So what did they teach you, and who helped you, and what did you learn about Habitat in the process?
Yeah, so the core team, I think the way they talk about Habitat is like it's this big tool that does, builds your packages, runs them in production, any environment that you want, and does this continuous delivery thing. There's too much to unpack there. Like, no one can master that. That's a lot. But what I did was, step by step, I said, hey, does it work like this? Does this part work like this? And they're like, yeah. So that's just my technique. Most things, new things, are built on old technologies. You just got to kind of peel back some of the marketing and look at the implementations and say, you know what? I know what this does now. Thanks for the guidance. Let me just go be off on my own. And they actually have really good docs. Like, bonus to them, they have the docs. So what I learned was I can basically take my existing workflow and wrap Habitat around it and use it as 3 different tools. So that's what my keynote was about, using Habitat to do a build. So instead of using a Docker file, you can use this Habitat plan file, which does their own build process. And the second piece was like the configuration management stuff that Chef used to do so well. That's kind of built into Habitat. So if you think about it, you can just use that part inside of Kubernetes and kind of like not use everything that Habitat does.
So so were you satisfied with that? Does it have that? It seems like you are, because what you said on stage, at least today, is like you can tell that the people who built this use it as well.
Yeah, we started to see this trend, right, where some projects you can tell that the people who use it every day are also working on it. Like, for example, there was that piece where you want to build your first Habitat app and you go into this environment. All your code is there. You can try and fail. And it's I don't know if you saw the stuff that was coming out of the tool. It tells you everything about what's happening.
Right.
And you can tell that someone probably ran into simple problems and they decided to fix it versus just patching over it. And it feels like that for a new user. I actually was able to build an app, deploy it, and then be able to give a talk the next day within maybe a 6-hour, 8-hour time range. I think that speaks highly to any tool.
what is the role of Habitat? How do you see its role kind of in the, overall kind of ecosystem? I mean, Chef's talking a lot about continuous automation, which I think is a great theme.
Yep.
And but is, and Chef has a history as a configuration management company, and Habitat seems to like have that built into it, that configuration management built into it, so you can use it effectively to just to automate applications. Is this a missing piece?
Yeah. So during the talk, I talked about this is the piece that Kubernetes is responsible for, placing things where they belong, maybe getting the network into that stack, maybe even dealing with storage. But once your app is actually running, Kubernetes is not part of that equation. So Kubernetes does not build containers. Habitat does, really good configuration language for doing so. One thing that I also highlighted in the talk, that the Habitat team actually has a package for everything you use. So for example, in the Docker world, you would say from Red Hat, and then you start installing a bunch of things from the Red Hat distribution. Whereas in Habitat, they already have things like Golang and Ruby and Python all in their own repository, so you don't have to bring in all that extra stuff. So they build containers and spit them out, and then when they're running it in Kubernetes, then they manage things like the configuration. So it seems like a lot of learnings from just using Chef and building it themselves, and then watching customers, and then looking at the new world. And I'm pretty sure they looked around and said, okay, all of these tools don't do this, so let's go and attack that. And I think they've done a good job in terms of execution. So I can see a Kubernetes user using something like Habitat for parts of their life cycle, and we plan to work with them a little bit to say, hey, here's how you can integrate better with Kubernetes, just to make it a little bit easier for people that are already using Kubernetes.
Such as?
So for instance, inside of Habitat, when you deploy a set of applications, they bring their own like communication channel, right? Consensus group is what we call it. And then they pass information back and forth. Well, when you're inside of Kubernetes, it could be thousands of applications. And then that may or may not scale in the Kubernetes context, especially between multiple clusters. But what Habitat could do is when it's running in Kubernetes, it doesn't need to use its own internal thing. That works great when you're just on a VM and you don't have the big orchestrator. Instead, just let Kubernetes do it. So that's what I did in my talk. I put my secrets and configs in Kubernetes, and I built this little glue thing that ran on the side of Habitat. When the file changed in Kubernetes, Kubernetes knows where to push it. I just watched for changes, and I just told Habitat about it. So they could do that natively themselves and get rid of the sidecar, and they would just play nicer inside of Kubernetes, and then all Habitat users don't even need to know that's what's happening.
So the consensus algorithm itself then?
Yeah, so they do it because they work on any platform. Docker Swarm, Kubernetes, hand-rolled system internally, Nomad. So they will bring a bunch of missing pieces to other platforms. What they should try to do, and I think they're open to working on it, is saying, okay, what does this platform offer that's unique? And the way I'm thinking about it now, if I were to think about a good marketing angle for Habitat, would be they take your app and make it habitable in other environments.
Habitable.
Yeah,
I like that.
Like if you're in the water, you bring a boat.
Right.
If you're in the desert, you don't drag a boat across the sand. You bring another vehicle, and I think Habitat can be that transforming vehicle underneath.
Oh, well, that's a kind of configuration management story in some respects too.
It's a micropath to me in some ways, right? So it's not too far from what we saw from JBoss, right? You put your app in JBoss, and then JBoss did all this other stuff. So JBoss is this application server from Red Hat or from the Red Hat community largely. And the JBoss community is like, hey, all this stuff is hard, like doing TLS and rate limiting, monitoring, debugging. All that stuff you can get from most of these application frameworks, but they're pretty heavy. Sometimes they only work for one language, and you got to go all in. Whereas Habitat is like, well, what we'll do is we'll put enough of that layer around your app, write your app in any language, and then we'll make it something that just close to your app. So that means in Kubernetes, you could have some stuff running with Habitat, some stuff just running with just straight Docker containers that you're doing today. And that's a little bit different than what you would do with like Cloud Foundry or OpenShift, where you got to buy into the whole pass kind of for everything. Right. So I think having this idea that you just bring the paths to the apps that need it. I'm not saying it's fully fleshed out, but it's an interesting angle when you look at the way people have multiple things running in their infrastructure.
It's not so heavyweight then.
It's pretty lightweight. I think if people touch it with their hands, they'll see what it's doing, and these are some of the things you would do anyway.
Right.
Like one example, not running your container as root.
Right.
So if you have a binary, it's really hard to do that just using a Docker file alone. Usually you bring in another binary that will start up, and doing your Docker file, you have to kind of create users and do all this orchestration during build time. And then when your app runs, you try to have this thing, fork your thing as a different user. Habitat just has that logic built in. Habitat creates a Habitat user with less privileges. It starts your application with less privileges, and it also runs with less privileges. So some of the best practices for how to build a container are already in Habitat. So I think for people that have been doing containers for a while and are not quite satisfied with the current build tools, Habitat might be really, really nice just for the building containers part.
But on a scaled out basis, there either you need to like build something custom for yourself, such as the sidecar you built.
Well, actually, you don't really need to do that, because I think a lot of what Habitat does, it will support what Kubernetes does out of the box. I'm just saying it does some things that Kubernetes doesn't do out of the box, like configuration templates at the app level and regenerating those and restarting your app. Kubernetes doesn't do that.
Right.
Kubernetes can distribute the file. So you could totally do that with Habitat today and get one for one. But if Habitat will go a little step further, then you can actually use all of Habitat's features. So it's not like it's missing anything.
Yeah,
it's just that it's not fully leveraged today.
Yeah, okay, that's a real distinction. Really interesting. So you use Google Now in your you used it at PyCon, right? And you use it here at ChefConf. Tell us about that process. I'm just really curious.
So everybody's like machine learning, AI, and all these things, and we hear all these terms. They're like, well, what does it do actually, right? Everyone wants to know, like, what does it do? So one good use case of, like, I don't like to say AI because it sounds like too heavy-handed for what some of this stuff is actually doing. But when you think about people automating the way information is used to deliver like a good experience, like you're watching Netflix and you watch a show and it says you might prefer these next other shows. And that's just based on some of your data, your watching patterns. But it's just your data, and it's making a prediction that you will probably also enjoy these. And if they do that enough, they'll probably be pretty accurate on what you watch. They start to kind of learn, quote unquote, what you want to do. So when I think about some of the advancements in like speech to text, right? Me being able to talk natural language into something, and on your phone, so it's a Google Assistant that runs on iOS now. It's also built into Android. But when I say something, I watch it correct me because it's learning over time. When I mispronounce Kubernetes, you can see it correct to Kubernetes and then send it back. So the way the process works is you have something like a Google Home or an iOS device running the Google Assistant. You can write what we call like a conversation flow, and I use a tool called API.ai. So you go there, and then you're like, hey, here's my user's intent. They intend to deploy something to Kubernetes. So you just write a sentence in there. Deploy the Habitat app, right? So then you can also have parameters. So the user could also say, deploy the Habitat with version 1.0.
So that's what you were doing out there. You were being I noticed you were being very careful about what you were saying.
Exactly, because I haven't had enough time to really draw a full conversation. You can imagine if I wanted to support various permutations of this, I would have to go in there and do a few of them, but they do have some learning built in. So all those times that it was making mistakes, I could go back to the logs and say, this should have been mapped to this should have been mapped to that. So the next time I do it, it'll be much smoother and account for my mistakes because they'll be able to predict a little bit more. And this is what they mean by learning, right? So this is assistant learning when I go back in and say, this should have been that. And the other thing that it does is it knows how to extract parameters out of what we say. So when I say deploy the Habitat deployment version 1.0, it knows to take 1.0 out, put it in a parameter, and then the final piece of this puzzle is it sends it to your custom backend that was running on Kubernetes. It takes that little callback, the webhook, and it says, oh, I process it. I actually made real calls to Kubernetes to get real information, and I can just return a string, and then my phone will speak it back to me. So that's why it felt very interactive in terms of I do something, I get a real response back after my code runs.
So the next generation of this is what for your purposes for demos?
Well, for me, I'm trying to learn a few things. I'm trying to learn usability. Not everyone can remember all the commands or all these tools. They're just too complex. So when you think about a conversational interface to something, like you're in your car, you don't want to say a bunch of things, right? You want to say navigate home. That means you need good presets. So now that I'm building things this way, I'm thinking, how can we make Kubernetes a little bit more usable with nice defaults, nice presets? And if we can get there, then I think new users could do something like, okay, Google, give me a Kubernetes cluster. It could spin it up and say, here's the IP address for your Kubernetes cluster. You're authenticated. What else would you like to do?
That changes programming.
Well, I mean, it gives us a much interface. And also, I used to work with a guy that was blind as a system administrator, and it was very hard for him to do everything we do. For example, we used to have these 8-character long passwords, and he would have to listen to the password and type it back in. I remember when we changed the passwords to 32 characters, and he was there just like, what? Okay, what the hell? And he just took his headphones off and threw them on the desk and was like, you guys are kidding me. I can't remember 32 characters. But imagine if he was able to authenticate via his voice and say, this is, and then it would just say, all right, you're allowed to continue, right? So I think we can actually build new experiences for people by being able to leverage multiple input devices, including your voice.
That becomes very human. I mean, very human way of thinking about working.
And that was the theme today, right? I mean, I think Adam talked a lot about we should be able to say these things. We should be able to just ask, what is the user's intention? I want to deploy. I don't want to use Kubernetes. I don't want to use all of these tools. I just want to deploy my app. So as a person providing an interface to that system, I can authenticate you via voice, take your intention, and map it. So we got these phones. So let's say you're in the East Coast and you say deploy my app. Well, I know where your location is. I could just prefer a compute region on the East Coast, maybe because that's where you are. I can start to infer a lot more information because I know a little bit more about you.
So where do you want to take this demo from here? What are you were mentioning?
So my inspiration is Iron Man. You know, Iron Man has Jarvis, and he can walk around anywhere, and he can have all kind of banter. He can do amazing things with it. So I think if I keep at it, maybe within a year or two, I'll have enough of these interactions where I can literally just have a natural conversation. And I want to explore building like better headset integration so I don't have to actually hold the phone.
Yeah.
So I can just walk on stage and just start having a conversation, and then it just starts doing things on my machine, you know, switching to a browser, switching back to the terminal. And I have some prototypes that let me do that.
Oh, that's so cool. Kelsey, co-host, great to have you here.
Awesome. Thank you.
A lot of fun. You really did it. That was dope.
Oh, Alex, you're in the club now. That was a proper use of dope. Okay. Some people don't know when to use it or how to use it.
Yeah.
You win.
I win. Okay,
all right?
Good. All right, thanks a lot. Chef has been our sponsor for the podcast from ChefConf here in Austin, Texas. Learn more about Habitat, Inspec, and Chef's focus on continuous automation at chef.io. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Bakers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.